From our perspective, from Oxfam's study perspective, it is in fact an extremely important piece of work that I think truly highlights the fundamental importance of climate adaptation strategies to address food security issues. And indeed, this is not a tangent to food security. I think as Jerry's description of the work really shows, it's integral to, closely bound up with issues of food security. And I think the study underscores the degree to which policymakers really need to take this lesson on board, and also the scale of the challenges, including in terms of dollars that we face. And I think it underscores, just to briefly to add to that, I think it underscores urgent action on the two fronts that we always describe as the key fronts of addressing climate change, and that's adaptation in the immediate term. And even if we were to eliminate emissions, greenhouse gas emissions that cause climate change today, we would still be facing 2 to 3 decades of increasingly warmer temperatures. So addressing the impacts today, developing the responses and building the resilience is absolutely necessary. And of course, we also need to engage in mitigation, that is emissions reductions, so that the consequences are not far graver in the future, several decades out. I think one of the things that is noteworthy in the report is its emphasis, and Jerry even ended with this, on community-based adaptation strategies, focusing on vulnerable communities and fully engaging them in the process of building resilience to climate change. That has to be the core basis for any adaptation strategy, ultimately. And I'd like to talk briefly, before getting to the policy opportunity challenges and opportunities ahead of us, I just wanted to comment briefly on several areas in which I think IFPRI could expand its work, and I know these have been on Jerry's mind as well. One area has to do with institutional questions, and for example, land tenure is a key question in many regions, and there have been studies linking equality of land tenure to success in irrigation investments. So this is very much an issue that deserves examination going forward, and there are other institutional issues as well along these lines that deserve some study. Secondly, I would point to risk transfer through such tools as insurance as an area that also can be expanded on in looking at these issues. Jerry briefly alluded to increasing climate variability as an issue that hasn't really been fully looked at in this study, and I think others. And we've been working to develop a pilot microinsurance program in Ethiopia together with Swiss Re. It's a weather-indexed microinsurance program. There are other initial efforts, I think, at microinsurance out there as well. I think this whole area of insurance and how to address variability and risk transfer is critical. Lastly, and this came up briefly as well, is the question of synergies between adaptation, between building resilience to climate change, and mitigation, reducing emissions. I think this is especially an area that deserves examination for approaches that can restore and retain soil carbon through practices such as avoided tillage, agroforestry, mulching, cover cropping, and so forth. And these strategies, many of them agroecological in approach, can often provide both adaptation and mitigation benefits. And I would say even without the mitigation benefits, I think some of these approaches are in fact something that should be taken up on the adaptation front. So with that as backdrop, just a couple of comments there on where we can go in terms of research from here. I want to turn now to the question of policy and the policy context that we find ourselves in today and how we can address these agricultural questions there. The recent McKinsey report, which some of you may have seen, that came out, showed that adaptation actions in many cases can be quite cost effective, but they will also require significant upfront investment. And one thing that Oxfam has stressed in talking about the importance of investment in climate adaptation is the need for this to be additional investment to existing ODA commitments. This cannot be something that comes out of what the United States or other governments other developed country governments have agreed to put forward for development assistance. It's a new challenge. This is an added burden on developing countries, and so the financing needs to be new and additional. One of the most important contexts for addressing this financing need, the need for these investments, is, of course, the climate legislation that is currently under consideration on Capitol Hill. And just last week, Senators Kerry and Boxer introduced a new piece of legislation, a comprehensive climate and energy bill that is meant to build on what the House has already done. The House passed legislation in June, and this is meant to, in May, I think, this is meant to build on that effort. And of course, it's quite timely leading up to the Copenhagen meetings of the UN negotiations in December. That legislation actually doesn't address some of the key issues that we're concerned with today for a couple of reasons. One is that the international provisions, the International Adaptation Program provisions and some of the other international provisions are not in that initial draft that Senators Kerry and Boxer introduced last week. I think that as the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and Senator Kerry is planning to introduce that language within the next week or so. And I think we can anticipate that that language will look very much like what was in the version of climate legislation passed by the House. Those adaptation provisions were quite good in many respects. They address the importance of community-based adaptation and the integration of communities in the development and implementation of adaptation programs. It points specifically to agriculture as an arena in which adaptation must take place. And I think we can anticipate that Senator Kerry will very much follow that model. The other question that's outstanding, however, is the level of resources that's going to be provided. That is something that we expect Senators Boxer and Kerry to incorporate into their bill just as it's about to reach the Environment and Public Works Committee for consideration in several weeks. And there's a major outstanding question about what the level of resources will be. The principal tool or mechanism for generating resources is through the use of emission allowances. And let me, since some of you may not be familiar with climate policy architecture, let me just quickly describe this. In the legislation, various polluting entities, firms, et cetera, would receive through various means a set of allowances to cover the emissions that they emit. In some cases, those allowances will be freely given to them. In other cases, those allowances will be given for various public benefits to various other institutions. For example, state and local governments in the case of activities taking place inside the United States. We have lobbied, and many of our allies have lobbied, for some of those allowances to be set aside for use for international adaptation, including for agriculture. And in the House-passed legislation, 1% of those allowances were set aside for international adaptation. In the year 2015, that amounts to about $650 million a year, the value of those allowances, when they can be traded on the open market. And so either the government will sell them or institutions, various civil society organizations or others will receive those and be able to use those allowances, sell those allowances and get that value. But stepping back from that architecture, the point is that it's about $600 to $700 million that would be available a year. And given what we've heard with Jerry's presentation, this obviously doesn't meet the test in terms of the level of resources that are going to be needed for adaptation in the agricultural realm alone. And there are many other arenas in which we will need investments in adaptation, not just in agriculture. Even if you figure that the U.S. is responsible for about a quarter of historical greenhouse gas emissions and should pick up about a quarter of the tab for adaptation, internationally, our $650 million is still shy of what's needed just for agriculture. So we have joined with others in what's not necessarily an easy policy and political environment to encourage a tripling of those allocations so that it would be on the order of about $2 billion a year that would be available for adaptation in developing countries across the board. Let me just give a little bit of context in terms of current U.S. figures. There's been a smattering of USAID funding for adaptation. The U.S. contributions to date to international multilateral institutions for adaptation have essentially been zero, but the current appropriations for fiscal year 2010, working their way through Congress, would raise the multilateral contribution to about $125 million a year. There are several institutions multilaterally that are now set up to undertake adaptation. There are two that are operated out of the Global Environment Facility, the Least Developed Countries Fund and the Special Climate Change Fund, each of which does do adaptation work. There's also at the World Bank a program called the Pilot Program on Climate Resilience that now is undertaking, that's essentially an adaptation program, a relatively new one that sunsets when there's a new international agreement. And there's an adaptation fund under the Kyoto Protocol. And since the United States doesn't currently, isn't a party to the Kyoto Protocol, we're not providing any funds through that mechanism either. In any case, we're still at a very small number in terms of our contributions. And it really is time, in our view, to address the needs that Jerry laid out so well. The other issue I want to quickly address in terms of U.S. legislation is the adaptation mitigation overlap, which I briefly alluded to. And legislation is an excellent opportunity to address this, to put resources, especially for capacity building, into developing countries to be able to do two things at once, both to adapt to the climate consequences that they're facing and also to help contribute to the global effort to reduce emissions. And that's something that we've teed up, but I think have a ways to go with Capitol Hill in incorporating in legislation. The other big context, of course, for addressing these issues is the UN negotiations, the international negotiations as we head toward Copenhagen. And we're in a bit of a flux right now in that process. There are meetings ongoing right now in Bangkok to develop the negotiating texts for Copenhagen, and I think we'll know by the end of the week a bit more what the shape of those texts are. And many of the issues that I've already described are really key there. The nature of adaptation, financing and delivery, the degree to which communities are really part of the puzzle, the level of resources that would be provided, some of these questions about links to mitigation. All of that is very much on the table, but there's quite a lot of work to be done in the couple of months we now have leading up to Copenhagen. Let me just say that even if we were to get a fairly robust and comprehensive deal in Copenhagen, a lot of the details, and I think this is especially true for an area like agriculture that's relatively new to the discussions, will have to be worked out in the months following Copenhagen. And we've seen that in the past with the Kyoto Protocol, that not everything was finalized at Kyoto, and much of the detail work had to be done. So keep your eyes on this space of agriculture and climate, I think, even past the moment of Copenhagen. So to wrap up, I think the IFPRI report has given us new impetus to address the food security implications of climate change. And there's a real challenge before us, clearly, but also significant opportunities. And I hope that collectively we all can seize them. Thank you.